continues, the price for these failures falls on local communities, which risks safety and endangers the well-being of migrants. Last year, there were more than 2.5 million migrant encounters on the southwest border, nearly a 27% increase from 2021. These are not sustainable numbers, and they will only increase with the end of Title 42 in several weeks. As we will hear from our witnesses today, border communities face difficult decisions when left to fend for themselves in the face of a problem that is not their responsibility, choosing how to allocate their limited finances and staff to manage these additional challenges. Ultimately, it leaves important work undone. Late last year, I heard from the fire chief in San Luis, a small community of roughly 37,000 individuals right on the Arizona-Mexico border. At that time, 3 of his city's ambulances were being used solely to care for migrants, leaving just 2 remaining for the community. The border city of Yuma, Arizona, represented today by Mayor Nichols, has just 1 hospital, the Yuma Regional Medical Center. According to Yuma Regional CEO, the hospital spent approximately $20 million in uninsured medical bills to treat migrants between December 2021 and May of 2022. Since 2019, I've secured over $1 billion in funding to help ease the financial burden on nonprofits and local communities who are providing food, shelter, and other services to migrants to ensure that the migrant crisis does not become a homelessness crisis. However, red tape makes it difficult for the government to quickly move this funding to the communities that are most in need. There are, however, certain groups that benefit from the ongoing crisis: the cartels and criminal organizations responsible for smuggling people and deadly drugs across our border. In southern Arizona, law enforcement has seen a troubling new trend: cartels using social media platforms to recruit and exploit American teens, some as young as 14 years old. They lure Arizona's children and young adults with promises of easy money, and they have them drive migrants in contraband north from the border. These teens are getting in dangerous high-speed chases with police, some of them before they even have their driver's licenses, risking the lives of everyone else who happens to be on the road with them. My recently reintroduced bipartisan and bicameral legislation, the Combating Cartels on Social Media Act, will help keep Arizona families safe by fighting back against this new trend. Our act will establish and implement a national strategy to combat cartel recruitment activity on social media and online platforms. And I cannot thank Ranking Member Langford enough for joining me in leading this important legislation. Today's hearing gives us an opportunity to recognize the full scope of the costs of the border crisis. I hope that the information we gather today will motivate others to join us in advocating for common sense solutions to our broken border policies. America's border communities cannot continue to wait. Finally, I would like to note that there are leaders from all over the southwest border that I wish could be here today to tell their stories. In lieu of their attendance, I ask unanimous consent that the statements they submitted be entered into the record. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. And now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Langford for his opening statement.
Senator Sinema, thank you so much for having this hearing. This is an incredibly important topic. I've had the privilege of being down along the Arizona border with you a couple of times to be able to see firsthand what is happening there. Had the opportunity to be able to meet some of our witnesses that we have today in that same area as well. And it's incredibly important that we get these issues on the record as part of the congressional record as well. So thanks for continuing to be able to work on this. Last Congress, we took a look at the issues facing our ports of entry along the southwest border in 2 separate hearings. During those hearings, we discussed numerous issues around the ongoing border crisis and what's happening in the ports of entries around drug interdiction. Now we're dealing with the Title 42 issue, and the Title 42 issue, Title 42 status now expiring if a court doesn't intervene on May the 11th, which is coming incredibly quickly, which will make the worst border situation in American history even worse. The United States Customs and Border Patrol Protection has encountered more than 5 million migrants at the southern border since January of 2021. CBP has seized more than 35,000 pounds of fentanyl along the southern border since January 2021. In the first 6 months of this fiscal year, CBP has seized nearly the same amount of fentanyl it did during the entire fiscal year 2022. CBP has seized more than 350,000 pounds of meth along our southern border since 2021. That is the primary killer in my state, in Oklahoma. Based on DHS projections, we'll likely see between 11,000 and 13,000 migrants cross the border per day once Title 42 expires on the 11th of May. And based on current trends, the fentanyl and hard narcotics that are being interdicted at the border will continue to skyrocket. While I'm glad that we're catching a lot of these deadly drugs, we also understand that there's a tremendous number that we are not catching as they're coming across the border. As Senator Sinema has rightfully noted, the situation has significant impacts on our border communities, but also not just our border communities, but as has been often said, every state is a border state now with the movement of illegal drugs into our country. Just last week, Mayor Eric Adams claimed that the national government has turned its back on New York City due to the significant number of migrants who have resettled there. He is facing a $4.2 billion budget shortfall, and in his own words, every service in New York City is going to be impacted by the asylum seeker crisis. Here in Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser has declared a state of emergency over the number of recent border crossers who have arrived and has urged the White House to activate the D.C. National Guard in response, which the White House has not chosen to actually do. Both this administration and the Trump administration activated FEMA at the border to address the border crisis. However, DHS, Inspector General, and Government Accountability Office have raised concerns about the need for more oversight and transparency regarding FEMA's use of taxpayer dollars at the border with how they're actually being used. The effects of this crisis are readily apparent in my home state. In 2021, which is the last year where we have complete data, Oklahoma reported 604 methamphetamine-related deaths and almost 300 fentanyl-related deaths. Most of those drugs came across the border from Mexico. CBP has done some really good work recently through Operation Blue Lotus to stop dangerous drugs from entering the country. They've had some good success with Blue Lotus. However, CBP told my staff in a recent briefing that they will terminate Operation Blue Lotus to interdict drugs coming across the border on May the 11th. They've told us that it has nothing to do with Title 42 ending, but that is way too coincidental that the same day Title 42 ends, CBP is also ending, through instructions from the White House, Operation Blue Lotus to interdict drugs along our border. While CBP says it's coincidental, it's hard to believe. Addressing the upcoming surge when Title 42 terminates will require significant manpower and intelligence support. And we assume that CBP will be strained at that moment, and so they'll be literally pulling people off the line, interdicting drugs, to deal with the quantity of migrants coming. Between 2017 and 2021, fentanyl deaths in Oklahoma grew by more than 450%. Between 2020 and 2021, fentanyl deaths doubled. While all of us are aware of these drugs on our communities, the border crisis has some other very unique and concerning impact on Oklahoma and an increase in labor trafficking as well. This is not a surprise. We've tracked it for years. A New York Times investigation recently found that unaccompanied minors have been placed in severe labor trafficking situations all across the country. This is an affront to the rule of law and shows just how inhumane our current border policies are. The Office of Intelligence, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection recently informed my staff there's been a significant uptick in the number of migrants who are paying the cartels a deposit to cross the border and then are forced to work off the rest of their debt they owe to the cartels while they're in the country. In Oklahoma, some of these migrants will end up working in horrible labor trafficking conditions at marijuana farms across the state. A spokesman for the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics recently stated, specifically related to the marijuana industry here in Oklahoma, we've had some workers who haven't been paid, who are living in deplorable conditions on some of these farms. They would meet the definition of labor trafficking, human trafficking, but they won't verbalize a complaint because of the fear and the desperation of that job. Last December, 4 Chinese nationals were brutally executed on an illegal marijuana farm in Oklahoma. While investigators have not released to us the immigration status of those Chinese nationals, NBC News reported that law enforcement officials have reported a rise in black market operators using human trafficking victims, including Chinese nationals, to grow and trim marijuana sold in legal dispensaries. Continued reports in the media and prior investigations by this committee have found that our open border facilities are facilitating labor trafficking across the country. One of our witnesses today will speak to another impact of the border crisis on communities in Oklahoma. Chief Hurd of the McAllister Police Department will share a story about an illegal immigrant who tragically killed one of his police officers recently. This individual should have been stopped at the border and prevented from entering without status. While our border security failed in this instance, this illegal immigrant was able to remain in the United States because the Biden administration has handcuffed ICE officers by forcing them to process recent border crossers rather than find and remove illegal immigrants. Strong border security does not begin or end at the border. It requires interior enforcement to ensure that those who break the law and cross the border illegally face consequences and are deported. Let me show you one quick chart on this to be able to show you graphically what I mean by this. This chart shows the number of people that are being encountered coming across our border since 2015. It's the orange line, and you can see that great acceleration. The blue line are actually ICE removal numbers. How many people ICE has actually removed from the country. You'll notice in 2020, the numbers started skyrocketing for the number of people coming into the country illegally, but since 2021, the number of removals has plummeted almost to zero. So literally at the moment, we have record numbers of people illegally crossing the border. We also have almost no one in the country actually being removed by ICE. Literally, people are coming in and almost no one is being removed by ICE in the interior of the country. I hope this administration strengthens a proposal that is put out for comment. We've yet to be able to hear that they're going to actually implement the proposal they put in place to be able to deal with asylum requests coming across the border. They've received comments, they've closed the comment period, but we've yet to see if they're, number one, going to actually enforce this rule or if they're going to continue to be able to strengthen this rule. I'm interested today to hear from our witnesses about the impacts on the border crisis in the communities they serve, and I do appreciate very much all of these individuals traveling a very long distance to be able to be here as a part of this hearing today. Senator Sinema, I would ask for two other pieces of information to be entered into the record. One is the Bureau of Narcotics from Oklahoma on the drug threats in Oklahoma, our specific data. And the other one is a letter from Wade Gorley, the police chief in Oklahoma City, about what is happening in our state, specifically in drug use and how this has rapidly spiked in the days ahead.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I do appreciate our witnesses here and appreciate the hearing today.
Thank you, Senator Lankford. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if all of our witnesses would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. We will now hear from our witnesses. I'll ask each of our witnesses to keep their remarks to 5 minutes. Your full written statements will be entered into the hearing record. Our first witness today is Mayor Douglas Nichols. Raised in Yuma, Mayor Nichols has been serving as the mayor of Yuma, Arizona since 2014. He began his third term as mayor in January of 2023. He serves as the founder and chairman of Forefront Ed's governing board, an internationally focused organization of regional mayors and elected local officials that include states on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Additionally, he serves as president of the Arizona League of Cities and Towns and is on the Arizona Commerce Authority Board of Directors. In 2021, he was appointed to the Environmental Protection Agency Local Government Advisory. Doug, welcome. It's great to see you again, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chair Sinema, Ranking Member Lankford, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the impacts of increased migration along the southern border. Yuma is located at the southwest corner of Arizona along the Colorado River, adjacent to Mexico, and we directly feel changes in migration, which brings us great concern over the termination of Title 42. Historically, illegal migration in Yuma has had its peaks and valleys. In 2006, the Yuma Border Patrol sector experienced a record of 146,000 interdictions of undocumented individuals crossing the border. The National Guard was deployed to construct the first barrier, and the Operation Streamline was enforced. This reduced our numbers to below 10,000 in 2007. In 2019, we saw a large migration of Central American families. The Yuma sector could not accommodate the increase, and migrants were released on the streets of Yuma. This caused me to proclaim my first emergency proclamation. NGOs spent more than $700,000 and used 93,000 pounds of food and clothing. Yuma Regional Medical Center treated 1,300 patients at a cost of $810,000, with only one-third of that cost being reimbursed by the federal government. Policies like Remain in Mexico protocol reduced the flow, and as COVID-19 became rampant, Title 42 took effect, and interdictions in the Yuma sector were less than 9,000 people for the 2020 fiscal year. In 2021, President Biden lifted the migration executive orders. There was an immediate increase in migrant crossings. Border Patrol was overwhelmed, and the migrants were again released on Yuma streets. In March, the Regional Center for Border Health began coordinating transportation for the migrants. They received funding for most of their efforts through FEMA. However, some reimbursements have been withheld. The migrant crossing numbers in the Yuma sector reached 260,000 in fiscal year 2021 and a new record of 310,000 in fiscal year 2022. This year, year-to-date, Yuma sector has had 120,000 migrants and 8,000 known gotaways. In December of 2021, the migrant volumes peaked at 1,500 a day. Yuma sector could not process migrants fast enough and intermittently stopped picking up migrants. Many migrants traveled into Yuma. And then I proclaimed a local emergency to prevent disaster of large groups of people without resources. The attempt to repeal Title 42 in December of 2022 resulted in similar volumes, which led to local emergency declarations by Yuma County, cities of San Luis, and Somerton. I want to stress the migrant crisis has negatively impacted Yuma far beyond what might meet the public eye. The agricultural industry is impacted by migrants entering fields. The crops they enter must be destroyed to maintain food safety. This costs the farmer $10,000 per acre and does not account for the wages lost by the workers. In 2022, Yuma Regional Medical Center had a dramatic increase in migrant patients for emergency care, intensive care, and maternity care. These efforts have resulted in $26 million of unreimbursed care. The economic growth of Yuma is compromised by this crisis. An Italian company looking to invest would not consider Yuma because of this crisis. Up to 5 times a day, our chamber and our visitors bureau answer calls asking, how safe is it in Yuma? We are not able to determine this loss of economic activity. On May 11th, Title 42 is slated to be lifted. The daily volume is expected to double over 1,000 people per day. U.S. Border Patrol or NGO will likely not be able to handle the flow and become overwhelmed, which leaves migrants on the streets of Yuma. This crisis is a federal issue. The federal government needs to own the entirety of the situation and not push it off to local governments and NGOs. There are a few actions I would suggest that we provide relief in the short term. President Biden could declare a state of emergency and send the message of no more trafficking. FEMA should take over the migrant sheltering and utilize their capabilities and resources. No migrants should be released into a community with less than 1 million residents, as the NGO response is unsustainable in smaller communities. The National Guard can provide transportation as needed. The asylum judicial process would become faster with assignment of more judges to the border or utilization of video conferencing. Implementing policies from the past, like Operation Streamline, will impact the flow, reducing the burdens on communities as well as DHS. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next witness is Mayor Clea Micah II. Mayor McCaw. I was like, wait a second, sorry about that. Mayor McCaw is in his first term as mayor. He was elected in 2022. He's a Sierra Vista native, elected politics, of course, as a second career for a mayor. As a commissioned officer, he served in the United States Army for 30 years before his retirement as a colonel. And for much of his career, he stayed close to home, stationed at our very own Fort Huachuca. Mayor McCaw is very active in his community. He serves as the senior pastor of the Sierra Vista First Church of God in Christ, the chaplain for the Sierra Vista Police Department and the Buena High School football team. He's the founder of the Sierra Vista Dream Center. And finally, he's a past president of the Greater Oaxaca Area NAACP. Mayor, it's great to see you in DC, and thank you for hosting us in your city recently. It's wonderful to have you here with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon to the chair, Senator Sinema, ranking member James Langford, and distinguished members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee regarding the issues that our city is having from the optics of a mayor, community leader, pastor, husband, mentor, and a father. Sierra Vista, Arizona has a population of 45,000 and is located about 20 miles north of the U.S. border with Mexico. Sierra Vista doesn't feel like much of a border town. It's a military community, home of the Army installation, Fort Huachuca, which is the home of the Buffalo Soldier. It has a diverse, well-traveled population who have settled there, often by the choice of a quiet, safe lifestyle with a wealth of outdoor recreational activities. And I would like to say it's the best city in this country, and I stand by that remark. The nearest port of entry is about 45 miles away, located in Naco, Arizona, and it's rare for dangerous border issues you sometimes read about to impact Sierra Vista. In fact, some of the national rhetoric on border issues makes it harder for us to attract visitors, businesses to our city because people assume the area is more dangerous than it really is. And I want to add that any false perceptions about violent crime in our community. But a recent trend of young people being recruited as so-called low car drivers does pose a very real danger to our residents and visitors, which fuels these narratives about violence near the border. Often using social media, cartels in Mexico recruit residents in the U.S. to travel south to the border, pick up migrants, whom the cartel calls loads, and transport them, travel north to exchange for money. Sometimes Sierra Vista does lie in the path of most of these load car drivers who need to travel through our community to proceed north. In 2020, the Sierra Vista Police Department responded to 19 vehicle pursuits in our city. In 2022, they responded to 38, which doubled. These low car drivers, who are often teenagers and young adults, are encouraged to drive recklessly through our town to discourage pursuits. This has created extremely dangerous situations, to include a low car driver speeding through an elementary school zone and crashing into a bicyclist, which was about 200 yards away from my mother's house. 2 other incidents resulted in serious accidents in major intersections in our town. One occurred north of our city, which ended in a fatality. The Sierra Vista Police Department has seen an increase in felony cases submissions to the Cochise County Attorney's Office from 343 in 2020 to 588 in 2022, which is a 71% increase. I want to reiterate that this increase does not stem from the violent crimes some may fear plague communities near the border. It's largely because of these low cars. These incidents tie up a significant amount of not only our police department's time and with our limited manpower, but all the law enforcement agencies that are in our region. I grew up in Sierra Vista and graduated from the local high school, Buena High School. Go Colts. I have also since raised my family there in this extraordinary community, and it is a wonderful place called home. But recently I have found myself worrying about my family members' safety in a way I never had before. I have a 16-year-old daughter who is a novice driver, and I've encouraged my family members to take different routes, to take city routes, city streets, and not go on the highways to avoid these low car drivers, because low car drivers have no regard for human life. I have also advised my mother to stay off the roadways. I am a pastor. I have advised my parishioners to stay off the highways because of these low car drivers. I'm not alone feeling this way. My citizens have witnessed this reckless, dangerous behavior of these drivers, and many others have seen the headlines, the damage and harm they have caused. One incident that is etched in my mind is a low car driver hit a 65-year-old woman coming home from going to a birthday party. Her son was trying to go to the birthday party as well and passed the accident. He did not know that was his mother. We had to tell him that was his mother. Her name was Miss Wanda. I leave you with this final statement. I serve the citizens of Sierra Vista to keep them safe, enhance the quality of life, and support our law enforcement responders. Today, I urge you to take immediate action on the matter of approving legislation to combat the cartel's recruitment activity on social media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor McCaw. Our next witness is Dr. Francisco Garcia. Dr. Garcia is the Deputy County Administrator for Health and Community Services and the Chief Medical Officer for Pima County. In this capacity, he oversees the Pima County Office of Emergency Management. This office has played a critical role in managing migrant releases, keeping the community safe, and ensuring that migrants are treated fairly and humanely. Prior to government service, Dr. Garcia achieved the rank of tenured Distinguished Outreach Professor of Public Health and Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Arizona, which we'll forgive you for, Dr. Garcia. As a proud Sun Devil, I'll let it go. He's a Head Start alumnus, first-generation high school and college graduate, and a native of the U.S.-Mexico border. Francisco's lived experience informs his approach to problem-solving in public policy and administration. Dr. Garcia, welcome. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Sinema, Ranking Member Langford, members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. The 130 miles of Pima County's border with Mexico is the longest of any county in this country. Since its creation in 1864, Pima County has had a close relationship with the people and government of Mexico. Nearly half of the population of Pima County, myself included, are immigrants from Mexico or the descendants of Mexican immigrants. Cross-border trade and tourism and the movement of Americans and Mexicans back and forth across the border is a significant part of our culture, our economy, and our heritage. After the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 and changes in economic conditions in Mexico, along with the rise of the Mexican drug cartels in the late 90s and 2000s, the county's relationship with the U.S.-Mexico border has become more complex. Federal efforts to interdict the illegal flow of drugs and immigrants into the United States has had a series of cascading effects on Pima County. Those are all well documented and well known to the members of this community. However, I want to focus on the most recent border policy changes that have severely strained the resources of Pima County, the city of Tucson, and our region's non-governmental and interfaith organizations. Just before noon on Good Friday 2019, Catholic Community Services and other members of the local interfaith community came together to ask the city of Tucson and Pima County for assistance setting up temporary emergency shelter for people seeking asylum. These asylum seekers were about to be released in Tucson by federal agencies after being granted the opportunity to make their case at a U.S. immigration court elsewhere in the country. But shelter capacity was already over. The county and city agreed, and at 9 p.m. that evening, we received the first busload from ICE. At that time, I thought it was going to be a temporary Band-Aid and our involvement would be just for a couple of months. Here we are 4 years later, and Pima County is still heavily involved in assisting with sheltering, feeding, medical screening, transportation of thousands of asylum seekers per month. Since 2019, federal agencies have brought to Tucson and released more than 150,000 individuals seeking asylum from several dozen countries. This December, county and community assistance was stressed to the breaking point with 15,000 record releases that month. Federal agencies have signaled that we may expect twice that number after May 11th. If that happens, we will be overwhelmed, and there will be many hundreds of people per day left to fend for themselves on the streets of Pima County. The question we get asked the most is, why is Pima County assisting local charities in this gargantuan effort? For me, as a child of the border, and for many in county, the answer is because it's the right and humane thing to do. But the best answer is because Pima County is a local government charged with providing for the safety, health, and welfare of our residents. Having thousands of people with limited resources, limited English skills, trying to figure out how to get to other parts of the country that is unfamiliar to them, with no food, little money, no place to sleep, is deleterious to the health, safety, and welfare of everybody in this county. We are obligated to protect the people of Pima County by assisting these asylum seekers to quickly and efficiently move on to their final destinations and their sponsored organizations or families. On average, the vast majority of asylum seekers, when assisted, are able to leave the county in 24 to 36 hours. Without assistance, they will linger for days. With scorching summer heat on its way, it is unacceptable to leave these individuals to suffer and struggle on their own in our community. The net effect of our efforts has been the masking of a crisis. Few in Tucson, Pima County, or Arizona know that federal entities are dropping off hundreds of people each day to local county-supported shelter operations. Pima County's role in managing this hidden crisis is working with the city of Tucson and humanitarian partners to meet the complex needs of these individuals. But we couldn't do this without federal resources, and those resources come from you. The federal investment is the key to everything. We in Pima County are fully aware that comprehensive immigration reform has been elusive, but Pima County doesn't want to be, nor should it be, in the business of sheltering and caring for people seeking asylum in the U.S. That should be the function of the federal government. If the results of this hearing and other congressional action is that Congress and the executive take this burden off our hands and stop releasing asylum seekers in our communities, that will be welcomed by the people of Pima County. But absent that sort of direct federal engagement, I implore you at a minimum to find a better, easier way to fund local governments and organizations who are shouldering this burden on behalf of the federal government. Thank you again for your time today. Mr. Shane Clark, our OEM director, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Ranking Member Langford, I'd like to recognize you to introduce our next witness.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Chief Kevin Hurd. As I mentioned in my opening statement, Chief Hurd serves as the Chief of Police for the McAllister Police Department in my home state of Oklahoma. He began with the McAllister Police Department back in 1995, worked through the ranks since then, serving as a narcotics task force, and then more recently as captain on patrol and in the criminal investigation division. Chief Hurd is a lifetime resident of Pittsburgh County and a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, which my daughter's graduate of OSU. We can talk about that later. I'm excited to have him here today. He has a difficult story to be able to tell, but also a story of what's happening in a community that is not right on the border, but is definitely affected by what's going on. Thank you for your willingness to speak here today.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Langford, for inviting me. On March the 16th, 2023, the McAllister Police Department was preparing for a funeral to pay our respects and our honors to former Chief of Police Dale Nave. He was the chief of McAllister for almost 20 years and hired a large percent of the officers that work there today. Before the funeral that morning, Shift Commander Captain Richard Parker failed to report to duty. He was found in his house deceased. After several hours at Richard's house, I sent several of our officers to escort Captain Parker to the medical examiner's office in Tulsa. On March the 17th, I sent 5 officers to escort Captain Parker from the medical examiner's office to a funeral home in Wetumpka. Our officers were met by officers from several agencies that joined the escort. As the procession was traveling south on US 75 through the city of Glenpool, Martin Rivas Rodriguez lost control of his vehicle as he was traveling north on 75. His vehicle jumped the guardrail and collided with Joseph Barlow's patrol unit, one of my officers. The collision hit with such great force, it destroyed the front of Joseph's police car. All of my officers tried to get Joseph out of the car. The damage was too extensive. Joseph was eventually cut out and transported by ambulance to St. John's Hospital in Tulsa. Mr. Rodriguez was arrested for driving without a license, and that's when it was discovered that he was an undocumented immigrant. Joseph passed away from his injuries sustained in the wreck on March the 20th. Joseph was kept on life support machines for 2 days because he was an organ donor. On March the 22nd, 5 of Joseph's organs were harvested, including his heart, his liver, and one of his lungs. These organs went to 5 other people. This tragedy was a great loss for our department and to our community. Joseph was an Army veteran, and he had only worked for the police department for less than 2 years. Joseph left behind a wife and a 1-year-old son, Chase and Hudson. In my career, I've worked patrol shifts, investigation divisions, and narcotics units. Drugs are obviously the greatest threat to my community. 23 years ago, while assigned to a narcotics unit, I was sent to Quantico, Virginia to get certified to be able to disassemble clandestine labs safely. At that time, methamphetamine was the main drug of choice in Oklahoma. People were buying and stealing pseudoephedrine and converting it to methamphetamine. About 20 years ago, Oklahoma made it illegal to purchase pseudoephedrine over the counter. You could only be purchased from pharmacies, and the purchaser had to show identification. This led to the end of Clan Labs in our area. It has been many years since the last working Clan Lab was discovered in Pittsburgh County. My agency works very closely with the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, OBN. These agencies have informed me that the narcotics that are present in our community comes from Mexico. Methamphetamine is still the most prevalent drug, but fentanyl is becoming more widely used. OBN told me that they seized 830.7 pounds of methamphetamine and 2.01 pounds of fentanyl in the year 2020. Last year, that number jumped to 3,549.39 pounds of meth and 122.72 pounds of fentanyl. That's enough fentanyl to kill every Oklahoma citizen 7 times. This places a great strain on law enforcement and the community. As the number of drugs available increase, unfortunately, the number of accidental overdoses also increase. In 2019, Oklahoma recorded 883 overdose deaths, and in 2021, that number jumped to 1,005. My department has had to supply every officer for the past 5 years with Narcan. Fortunately, many of my officers have been able to administer Narcan on several accidental overdoses and prevent many people from dying. Obviously, when there are more illegal drugs in the community, there is an increase in crimes, especially in property crimes. In my career, I've met thousands of people in need of assistance from law enforcement. Many of these have been victims of crimes. Some were just stuck in a bad situation and needed help. Many of these people have been undocumented immigrants. This part of our community is particularly vulnerable. In my dealings with this community, I've become aware of several reasons for this vulnerability, including language barriers, lack of trust in the police department, as well as other people taking advantage of them because of their reluctance to involve the police in their matters. I have personally met many victims that were hesitant to talk to the police, and I assume there are many more in McAllister that have been victimized and have not reported their crimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Hurd. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us on the committee when I express my condolences to you and the law enforcement community in your area for your tragic loss. Thank you for being here today. We will now begin the question portion of the hearing. Each member of the committee will have 7 minutes. I recognize myself for 7 minutes. I'll start with Mayor Nichols. Mayor Nichols, since 2019, Yuma has twice been so overwhelmed by the flow of migrants across the border that you have deemed it necessary to declare a state of emergency. Can you tell us what goes into determining that a state of emergency must be declared? What considerations are made as a part of that process, and what thresholds must be met?
Thank you very much. The ability to declare an emergency comes from our city charter. We're an Arizona city, charter city, and in there it refers to the great danger of life. It doesn't actually require the loss of life, but a threat to life. And it doesn't limit that just to residents or anyone specific. And it gives me a lot of latitude, but it's easy to see as you track these numbers, and I've got a great relationship with the local Border Patrol, and they show me the stats as they're coming through and some of the stories you're hearing that in both of these situations, we were going to end up with people on the streets that wouldn't have resources, that wouldn't have shelter, wouldn't have food, no one to receive them. And to me, that is an endangerment to life. And so given that, I wanted to prevent that, raise the attention, and potentially find solutions. And that's why we declare the local emergencies when those situations arise.
You know, Mayor, I appreciate your response. I think a lot of folks who aren't familiar with the Arizona-Mexico border don't realize that it is markedly different than other border communities in other states. The city of Yuma has no shelters, and if I remember correctly, on my last visit, just one bus stop. Is the city of Yuma able or have the capacity to provide assistance to migrants, particularly during the summer months?
So the city of Yuma itself does not. We have one homeless shelter, but it's specifically for more of the resident homeless. The transitional sheltering that migrants require, that doesn't exist in our community. And we have just checked on this on my way to this meeting. We have 2 buses a day that come that bring people to other communities for those transportation options. but those buses are generally mostly full anyway. So if you release 50 people, it could take days to get out of town.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor. Mayor McCott, in your testimony, you talked about the dangers posed by the load car drivers. These are the folks who drive at high speeds while smuggling humans or drugs. When this occurs, how does it impact law enforcement resources in your community? And you told us a little bit about how this impacts the residents of Sierra Vista, your daughter, your mother, your parishioners. What else does this mean for other residents throughout Sierra Vista?
Thank you for the question. One thing is tough to track border-related crimes within our city limits because most originates out in the county. Not being able to track the crime presents its own problems, such as how to migrate it. But when the load car and the pursuits happen, they all eat up our on-shift manpower for our police force. There are times that we only have 4 and 5 officers on staff, and it takes all of them to clear intersections or even to stop the vehicles through town or to get the vehicle stopped and make the arrest safely. If we get a vehicle stop, at least one or not even more officers, or even more officers is tied up with the arrest for about 3 to 4 hours. During the day, load car pursuits can pull our detectives off their assigned tasks and even our high-level staff off their assigned tasks. Border Patrol checkpoints have put a significant damper on pursuits. Having these checkpoints creates stash houses within our city limits where migrants are housed until the checkpoints go down to transport those migrants north. Stash houses picks up when the checkpoints are up, and they go down when the checkpoints are not there. Pursuits are less violent crime on the roads when the checkpoints are up. Checkpoints don't stop the pursuits, they deter them. With the increase of pursuits in Sierra Vista and the increase of public safety coverage, pursuits currently have moved to our east, which creates load cars going east, but those don't deter from Sierra Vista because they take wrong turns and come through our town. The pursuits are still constant wireless, regardless of where they are in the county. Pursuits can start far away and come in because Sierra Vista is the main artery going north. During drugs, as the committee says, drugs, the border issues is the most significant thing that affects Sierra Vista. It carries on from property crimes like shoplifting. The drugs come across the border, then they go to Tucson where they are cut up and they bring back down. One thing, Senator Sinema, I want to stop worrying about if my daughter get back home from volleyball practice. I want to stop worrying about if my mother get back home from Bible study. I want to stop worrying about, that's what keeps me up at night. That's what I worry about. When's the next citizen that's going to be serve as a fatality because of these load car drivers? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Garcia, Pima County has been an incredible partner to the City of Tucson and local nonprofits. Working collaboratively, Pima County has gotten over 130,000 migrants released into the county since April 2021 from CBP custody. And somehow, even with 130,000 releases, the county in coalition with the city and local NGOs have avoided street releases. So when considering the process of receiving migrants, what's the most significant challenge that Pima County faces, and what's most urgent need for reform, and how does this impact your employees?
Chair Sinema, thank you for the question. On 4 separate occasions, we have nearly averted what would have been the release of dozens of people onto the streets in Tucson. This occurred most recently when we had the massive flow of 15,000 migrants that month of December, and due to the terrific coordination with Border Patrol and the city, as well as our NGO, we were able to tap into resources and stand up hotels that were staffed by city and county staff in order to make that, in order to address that immediate need. It is the massive and unrelenting flow and volume of asylum seekers that is the most taxing and that is the biggest challenge for us. For city and county staff, for humanitarian staff and volunteers, it is unrelenting and exhausting. only comprehensive immigration reform is going to fix that. Short of that, we need to de-incentivize the entry of people in between the ports of entry, because that is what is causing so much of the havoc.
Thank you all for your answers. I'd now like to recognize Senator Johnson for 7 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this important hearing to highlight the impact that this border crisis is having on our communities and local counties. I'll put up my chart, just a quick little description of what the keys are here. The colors, the gold color is single adults being encountered. This is average encounters per month, or number of encounters per month. Blue is family units, and red is unaccompanied children. You'll notice back in 2014, I became chair of Homeland Security in 2015. So I've made multiple trips down the border. And first trips were during the border crisis of 2014, when President Obama declared it a humanitarian crisis when 2,000 people were being apprehended. Back then we called it apprehensions, because now we just call them encounters, because we encounter, process, and disperse. You can see that under President Trump, we had another surge. I think the worst month was approaching 4,000 people per day. Now we have what's happened over the last couple of years, this explosion. We've had Secretary Mayorkas in front of our committee a number of times. I've pressed him repeatedly in terms of what the real numbers are, in terms of total numbers coming into this country, encountered, processed, dispersed, known, unknown gotaways. I never get a straight answer. But I also ask him is, would you admit this is a crisis? And the most I've gotten out of it is he says it's a challenge. So I want to ask each one of you, is this a crisis for your city, for your county? I'll start with you, Mayor Nichols.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, this is a crisis. I don't know how you look at these numbers. And when you triple or double the previous high, how that doesn't create a concern that would be called a crisis.
By the way, we're down a little bit the last couple of months, but we've been over 8,000 people per day average compared to 2,000 when President Obama called that a humanitarian crisis. Mayor McCaw, is this a crisis?
Yes, sir, it is a crisis. Sir, we have, I think I'm safe to say, about 4 or 5 pursuits a day going through our town.
So Deputy Administrator Garcia, is this a crisis?
Senator Johnson, 150,000 asylum seekers processed in Pima County from 2019 to the present. Yes, this is a crisis. It is using up resources that we need to use for other purposes, even with the federal support.
Sheriff Hurd, is this a crisis, or Chief Hurd?
Yes, Senator, this is a crisis. The more that are allowed to come in, obviously, and I'm a long ways from the border, but the more drugs that we have to deal with, the more crime that we have to deal with in our city.
In the last fiscal year, and I asked Secretary Mayorkas here, he claimed not to know the answer, but in the last fiscal year, I believe there are 890 dead bodies found on the southwest border. I'd imagine you've encountered that and had to deal with that tragedy. So, I mean, the human toll, obviously the loss of life is enormous, but the sex trafficking, the human trafficking, the involuntary servitude, the flood of deadly drugs, just amplify the extent this is a crisis. What I want to talk a little bit about is the history of this. Back when I first started going down the border, back in the 2015, 16, 17, even during the 2019 crisis, I was surprised when I talked to local sheriffs, mayors, that it seems like most of the people coming across didn't linger. They were shot right through the city because they didn't commit crimes. They didn't want to get caught. They just wanted to get to their final destination. Is that the same thing happening now, or are they lingering? Is there more crime? I mean, can you, those of you who were in your positions back then in 2014 through 16, is there a difference today versus what it was the previous 2 peaks? I'll start with you, Mayor Nichols.
Thank you, Senator. So we don't see the large perceived violent crimes in our community. People are moving through. The problem we have, and the reason we declare proclamations of emergency, is because the transportation opportunities to leave the community, which is what the migrants are trying to do, don't exist. And that's where the emergency comes into play.
Again, we're getting very, and this is, the administration claims this is a success. They're getting pretty efficient at processing and dispersing, correct? To all points, all points.
That is correct. That is what I would say is a difference between 2014 and now, is in 2014, there was desire to stop the flow, and now it's looking to accommodate the flow.
Is there any way we know who these people truly are? I mean, we obviously don't know who the known and unknown gotaways are, but even when you're processing people, last time I was down the border, the Customs Border Patrol were told they were given a goal of about 8 hours, from first encounter to on a bus, on a plane, someplace headed throughout the, America. Mayor McCaw.
Sir, your question is, sir?
Do we know who these people are? Is there any possible way that we know who these folks are?
So, sir, we do not know who these people are. Most of the people that we apprehend are young people, young adults, as young as 14 years old. They are recruited from Phoenix, Tucson. They even come down from north. I think the first one we had was from Massachusetts. They get an app on their phone that is supported by, I guess, the cartel. They're given a point where to pick up their car, where to pick up the load, and head north. And all it's saying is just speed north to avoid the pursuits.
So, Mr. Garcia, again, they're passing through your counties, your cities so quickly. Do you have evidence of the sex trafficking? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. The Secretary had no idea the extent of it, but I don't know how these young women are paying off their human trafficking fees. I think we can only imagine the horror of it, but do you see evidence of that?
Senator Johnson, it's a complicated question. I've been managing this on behalf of the county in some form or fashion since 2013 and have experienced some of the same things that you have. Currently, we do not see that kind of evidence, in part because we are very efficient about moving folks through the community. We have to rely on our federal partners to do the kinds of security clearances pre-release that they do. We are not in that business, so we trust that the individuals that are handed over to us in civil society are individuals who have undergone vetting.
So, Chief Hurd, you're back away from the border, so you're where they're being dispersed to.
Correct.
One of the things I found quite disturbing is the stash houses, and some of these would be close to the border where they basically keep these people that kidnapped them, and they hold them for ransom to their relatives in Central America or Mexico, whatever. What are you seeing in terms of the human toll of some of the sex trafficking, the human trafficking, that type of thing in Oklahoma?
We do see some of that. We see in these communities that these people will be taken advantage of greatly. A lot of times by people in that same community. They know they don't want to come talk to the police. They're afraid to talk to the police because they put the fear in them that the only thing we're going to do is try to deport them. They don't ask for help. They are basically indentured servants, or they have to split their check, or they're paid below minimum wage, or those types of things. We run into all of that. We also run into them when they're breaking the law and they get arrested. Then we have a hard time trying to figure out who they are. And then they make bond and they're gone. They never show up for court. We don't know where they are, where they went.
Okay. Well, again, thank you all for your service, for dealing with something you should not have to deal with. And again, Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing.
Well, thank you, Senator Johnson. It seems evident from our witnesses' testimony today that the cartels have a different strategy of which type of migrants they're bringing through different ports or different portions of the country. So we're seeing very different individuals coming through the Yuma area than we are seeing come through the Cochise County area, which is different again from where we're seeing in the Pima County area. I'm going to recognize myself for another round of questions. I'm going to recognize Senator Lankford for his questions. And Senator Lankford, I'm going to go vote if you'll also chair while I'm gone.
I can.
Wonderful, thank you.
Total chaos will break out as I take over the chair. And Typical, yeah. Pardon me, I just ran to vote and came back, so we're all multitasking here, getting a chance to come back and forth. Thanks again for being here. Chief Hurd, thank you for coming to share your story. Please tell the families, thank you as well. This was not only a sacrifice for you to be able to come tell a very difficult story that just happened a few weeks ago, but also for the families to say yes. And So from my wife and I, and from our family and from all of Oklahoma, we appreciate what you're doing and how you're handling a very, very difficult issue, and for other families who are handling this, and to continue to be able to tell the story.
Thank you, sir.
Let me, you had several references in your testimony as well to methamphetamine and fentanyl. You also referenced that it is the understanding that this is dominantly coming out of Mexico. Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics has done a lot of work on this. I put some of that information into the record today as well. What are you hearing from the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics and from your own sources in McAllister on the source of the drugs that are coming into Oklahoma?
The source of our drugs starts in Mexico, and it works its way across the border either as a drug product, or maybe as a precursor. That is, once it gets into Texas, typically for us, then it is converted into a drug, or made into methamphetamine, or the fentanyl is already brought in. Typically, where I live, it comes through Dallas, Texas. The cartels, the mules carry it through Texas, through Dallas, come up 69 Highway and distribute it all, in McAllister is one place where between Tulsa and Dallas, and that's typically where we get it from.
You've been with the department more than 2 decades.
Yes.
Have you seen an increase in the drugs coming into McAllister in the past few years?
Definitely, sir. Like I said, 20 years ago, I worked narcotics, and we worked a lot of labs. I can tell you today that methamphetamine is cheaper today than it was 20 years ago, and the only reason for that is because it's more available.
We've heard a lot in the news lately about human trafficking, labor trafficking, individuals being able to move in and out to be able to work for the cartels. Are you experiencing that anywhere in Pittsburgh County or anywhere around McAllister?
The big problem that we run into is people in these communities gather together, and like I said earlier, they don't trust the police. So they get taken advantage of by other people in that community, or not necessarily in that community, but they get taken advantage of by other people because they don't trust us. They're told that if they report a crime, the first thing we're going to do is try to deport them or arrest them for being there, and they get victimized. And we see a lot of that. We do see a lot of crime from people obviously not driving with driver's license and not being able to drive very well, and then we have accidents, and there's no insurance, and we run into a lot of that stuff, and it escalates.
Okay. You talked about a lot of the drugs are coming into the area through Dallas. How are the dealers and individuals within the community, how are they connecting with this? Is this a cartel that you're seeing a presence of, or what are the connections here?
A lot of times it is connected to the cartels, is the information that I'm getting. Will be an immigrant will start a business, start a construction company, per se. This has happened not too long in our recent past. We've caught a fellow that had his own construction company, had several people working for him, constantly going back and forth to Dallas, occasionally going back and forth to Mexico, and used people in his construction company to distribute the drugs.
Are you seeing the same thing in some of the illegal operations that are growing marijuana in the state? We have some that have a licensed facility, and then some of them are illegal, that they're actually transporting the marijuana outside the state that are there. Are you sensing a connection of individuals that are illegally trafficked into the state to be able to work in some of these operations?
In my specific community, we don't have any of the big grows. I have seen those talking to OBN. I have seen, obviously, that made the news media. I have seen, the effects of that. I have seen that happen. But in my particular community, I haven't seen that, because we have lots of dispensaries and a few small grows, but they're indoor grows and mom and pop type stuff.
Yeah. So I just want to make a couple of quick comments to be able to get on the record and to be able to remind everybody that's here as well. The comments that you're making are part of the congressional record and will be then pulled by staff and others that are researching what to do about this in the days ahead. So all of your written comments and your oral comments and questions are exceptionally helpful, not just to this panel, but as we're going through different pieces in the days ahead, trying to pull a piece of legislation together, this congressional testimony gets pulled as a part of the permanent record of what needs to be done. So I do appreciate any recommendations that any of you have. I know Mayor Nichols in particular, you outlined in your oral testimony earlier some specific recommendations that you would say these are the things the federal government needs to do. One of those was dealing specifically with the issue of asylum. You had mentioned that individuals coming to be able to pursue asylum, we've got to get to judges faster. We need to have courts that are closer to the border. Why would that be?
Because what's really happening, thank you, Senator. What's really happening is people are being released pending a future court date, which could be 3 to 4 to 5 years down the road.
Oh, let me make it worse.
Okay.
If an individual crosses in Yuma, Arizona, as you know, because you've seen this process, as they cross the border, Border Patrol, and they go through the process with them of saying, where would you like to make your asylum claim to be able to go through that? They're told, for instance, if they selected New York City right now and said, I'm going to go to New York, they're released on their own recognizance to make it to New York however they want to, or connecting with other organizations. The next date for their first hearing, not their determination if they receive asylum, the next date available in New York City right now is in 2033, is the next available date. So they will wait 10 years before they do the first hoop. The next hoop is 8 years after that. So currently, an individual crossing in Yuma that says, I want to request asylum, will be 18 years before final determination. I hate to interrupt you, but it's worse than you think.
That's a lot worse than I think. I was just told the other day, there's 660,000 people waiting across the border when Title 42 is rescinded. They will come through within a month, and when they come through, they will be tacking on time to places like New York City.
Yeah, it'll be very significant. You outlined that in 2022, 310,000 people were encountered coming across the border in the Yuma sector. Right. But I want to just reiterate with that comment, Yuma has about 100,000 people. Do I remember that correctly?
That is correct.
Yuma has a population of 100,000. In 1 year, they saw more than 300,000 people cross the border illegally there. So I want people to understand the scope of what you're dealing with as a challenge there. And I cannot imagine the challenge on city services and for all that's happening, individuals that are moved over to other places, to Tucson or wherever it may be, to be able to try to manage what's actually going on there. But it's incredibly significant. I also want to remind folks as well, I've had conversations with Secretary Mayorkas on the specific issue of individuals that are crossing the border and how much information we know about these individuals. Because remember, as you all know, they're processed usually within 24 to 36 hours at this point and then released in the country in their own recognizance. I've asked Secretary Mayorkas, how many of these individuals do we know their criminal history? And they've gone back to be able to examine and look at it, and we don't. We know if they're on the terror watch list, but we literally don't know any criminal history for any of these other individuals other than, are they on our terror watch list, or do we have a criminal history in the United States for these individuals? And these are folks that are coming from literally all over the world. In many areas of the border, people that cross the border, they're literally from Eastern Europe, they're from Africa, they're from Central America, they're from South America, they're from Asia, they're from all over the world. The last time I was in Yuma, there was a significant number of folks. In fact, if I remember correctly, the particular month I was there was in January, last time I was in Yuma. There were more people that had crossed illegally that month from Uzbekistan into Yuma than there was from El Salvador. And by the way, El Salvador is closer than Uzbekistan. But there are people literally coming from all over the world here, and we have no criminal history, no background, no information on those individuals. What have you seen there in Yuma as far as the people staying longer than, let's say, 48 hours?
Generally, they do move through very, very fast, but we're seeing this year to date 112 different countries represented in the flow. So I don't remember how many countries there are in the world, but 112 is a very significant percentage of that. Thankfully, because of our nonprofit, when Border Patrol releases, they release to the nonprofit, and they help facilitate within the day moving people, most of the people, to regional airports to get on their way. With the ending of Title 42, that process is probably going to hit its capacity, and then that's when the releases to the streets of Yuma become a reality.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to recognize another border state, Senator Padilla, for his questions.
There we go. Wasn't lighting up. Obviously, many communities along the southern border have stepped up and provided the services for asylum seekers arriving at our border. We know it's not easy, but in the spirit of that safe, orderly, humane process that we want to provide as many asylum seekers as possible, it's not just been government doing the job, but in fact, as you referenced a minute ago, a lot of nonprofit organizations and NGOs that are participating here. I know in California, the state I represent, the federal, state, and local governments have worked collaboratively with NGOs to ensure that migrants have access to services they may need upon arrival in the United States. Since I've come to the Senate, I've fought to ensure that there's robust federal funding for the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to support these local efforts. First question is for Dr. Garcia. In your testimony, you mentioned that for the past 4 years, Pima County has relied on federal grants to provide these services. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what services are reimbursed by the federal government to aid Pima County? And if you're informed enough, maybe you speak to the timeliness of reimbursements.
Appreciate the question, Senator Padilla. One of the things that I made a point of is that we can do none of this absent federal support. Currently, the kinds of services that we are providing for these asylum seekers who, again, are in our community about 24 to 36 hours, the vast majority, is housing through both congregate and non-congregate settings. We provide food, we provide the medical kinds of clearance for those folks. We provide security, transportation, and related logistics. These folks have complicated needs. Some of them are very easy to move through. When you have a family of 3, it's going to take more effort. Some of folks have resources and a waiting family on the other end. Some folks may have fewer resources and just a telephone number. And so civil society organizations, Catholic community charities, as well as a variety of other are on the front lines trying to connect these people with resources in order to get them to the final destination. The issue of timeliness, critically, unfortunately, the current FEMA EFSP kind of funding strategy really does not allow us to plan for much more than 3 months at a time. You can imagine that this operation, which ranges from $1 to $1.5 million a month, is hard to plan for on a month-to-month basis. We need a longer time horizon. We need more reliable reimbursement. In the past, under the FEMA EFSP program, certain agencies have had a hard time getting that funding even up to a year.
And based on your experience and what you've observed, you talk about some of the funding, whether it's reimbursed on a timely basis or not, for housing, for transportation, et cetera. Are there any other gaps or areas of funding that the federal government doesn't cover that counties could sure use, particularly if we're looking at numbers increasing in the near future?
Sir, in the human services area, one of the critical things that will go away as Title 42 and the public health emergency is elapsed will be some of the coverage for medical screening and related services. We believe that we have a responsibility before a person boards a bus or boards an airplane to make sure that that person is safe to travel for their own sake, for the sake of other passengers, for the sake of our community. Some of those resources may be going away with the lapsing of the public health emergency.
Thank you. Now, I think a little bit of a greater context for the hearing today, and then back to a specific question. You know, as since I've arrived at the Senate, been part of many efforts and conversations working towards modernizing our nation's immigration laws, right? Everybody says we need comprehensive reform, we need comprehensive updating to the process in so many ways. Some people like to focus efforts on, DACA recipients and dreamers more broadly, others, workers in the agricultural sector and farm workers and others. There's a bunch of categories of immigration laws that need to be modernized, and whether we do it comprehensively or in another fashion, oftentimes I'm met with, well, I'm happy to do that, but we've got to address the border. I'm happy to do that, but Biden and the border. And so here we are, once again, talking specifically about the border. Now, one of the specific elements in this greater immigration conversation is asylum. United States law is very clear. Individuals, with some exceptions, do have the right to seek asylum at our border. Doesn't mean it's automatically granted, but it is lawful to seek asylum at our border, whether they arrive at a port of entry or not. I don't see anybody shaking their head in the negative at the table. But despite the way it's often discussed, this is a legal pathway enshrined in U.S. law. But unfortunately, physically coming to the border is often the only option for many individuals because there's such limited ways to apply for admission into the U.S. from other countries. It's one of the many things that's broken in our more comprehensive system. In fiscal year 2022, we only admitted 25,465 refugees, down from over 200,000 when the U.S. refugee program first began. Only 140,000 employment-based green cards are available to individuals in any given year, and only 55,000 diversity visas are granted. Dr. Garcia, how would increasing pathways to the U.S. for migrants benefit counties in planning and anticipating new arrivals?
One of the critical pieces that we are missing is the ability to do long and medium-term planning for the flow of folks who are coming across our border and who we are in the position of having to serve. We need predictability both in terms of the numbers, we need predictability in terms of the types of folks that are coming in. All that will serve us well in order to move folks efficiently to whatever that next location is that they need to go.
I'll just, and appreciate your responses here. My takeaway is if we expand the numbers of people being able to lawfully come and make that process a little bit easier, more clear, that benefits everybody and takes at least some of the pressure off those who seek to migrate unlawfully. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. We'll now start a second round of questioning. So I'll go back to Mayor Nichols and Dr. Garcia. The end of Title 42, as you know, is just 2 weeks away, and I have expressed multiple times serious concerns about the federal government's preparations or lack thereof. What are the most important actions that DHS must take and investments that they must make to ensure that this change in policy doesn't negatively impact your communities?
Thank you, Senator. I just will mention again, we share your concerns, your grave concerns. I was just notified that the anticipated people waiting currently to cross the border, waiting for the end of Title 42 is 660,000 people. And there are record numbers of people coming through the Darien Gap. So there's no relief inside, it's only a bigger wave. Some of the immediate actions would be, let's learn from the Del Rio experience. It took days to get resources to that part of the state of Texas. Let's pre-position some of those resources today. Let's pre-position ambulances and containers with food and supplies and medical supplies, medical professionals, mobile shelters and buses. Transportation is the single biggest thing that could help alleviate the issue on the communities at the border. But then again, it does just translate it into the rest of the country. You need to have increased staffing to continue to decompress the duties of our badged individuals who do a very critical element of the process. Our sheltering operations, I believe, really need to be taken over by actual FEMA activities and or the National Guard. Funding is important, but there are limits to organizations, and we need to recognize that. We talked about transportation, and then some diplomacy with Mexico to try to turn these caravans around, to have denial before they get to the border. And if there's processes that need to happen, maybe we can facilitate those asylum discussions into Mexico. And then really just the implementation of things that have worked in the past, like Operation Streamline would be one of those things that we could modernize and get it out. And things are in place to make that happen. Thank you.
Dr. Garcia.
Chair Sinema, Mayor Nichols really hits all the high points. The most important piece that I believe would be beneficial is clear and accurate communication with our federal government partners. we know that the folks who are charged with federal enforcement are in a difficult position. Our communities are also in a difficult position. It is it's a common mutual interest for us to coordinate that response. That means that being able to give us predictability wherever it is that we can in terms of the flow of people. That means also us being able to have honest conversations about capacity limits and about alternate strategies that are short of releasing people on the street. Finally, I would say that more than anything, for at least for us in Pima County, one of the continued concerns will have to be the predictability and stability of the funding stream that supports us so that we can achieve some degree of efficiencies of scale as we're confronting literally hundreds of thousands of people.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that funding issue because I saw Mayor Nichols shaking his head at that same time. You know, every several months we've had a debate here in the United States Senate about whether or not to continue providing this funding. One argument is that the funding provides immediate needed relief to border communities who are bearing the brunt of the federal government's failure to address this crisis. Another school of thought believes that providing this funding is just simply smoothing the way for an increased and more rapid flow of migrant traffic into the United States of America. And frankly, I think both of those are true, right? Both of those are true statements. Could you both just talk a little bit about, separate from the politics of the issue, what it would look like on the ground in a small rural farming community such as Yuma, and throughout Pima County, as you mentioned, Dr. Garcia, the largest county bordering U.S.-Mexico, if we didn't have that funding for our local governments and our NGOs?
Thank you, Senator. And for our NGOs in particular, they don't have a deep war chest to go to pull continual funding out of. So I believe in short term, they would shut down just for the lack of ability to pay their employees, cover expenses, pay for buses. Those things are critical to managing what's there today. But it is true, the problem is it's being managed, and so the urgency doesn't seem to follow the money. If there's an urgency tied to the dollars, so the decision makers are putting solutions forward while we're taking care of the dollar aspect, that's a more sustainable path than just continuing to feed money. But to cut off the money, you would end up with releases to the streets of Yuma, up to 1,000 people a day. You would have buses with maybe 50 seats available a day leaving town. So you have 950 people a day that are trying to find ways out of town. Yuma is not adjacent to much, so you're not going to be able just to walk to the next town. We're 180 miles away from the Phoenix metro area, about 150 miles away from the San Diego area. So those people are going to get orphaned into the community. And at that rate of release, I can't even begin to fathom what that kind of impact would be on food, on sheltering, particularly as we enter the 120-degree temperature ranges, on just life and safety for those people alone.
Mayor Nichols is absolutely on point. The day that resources stop flowing to communities, communities have to stop being able to assist with the transit of these individuals. That means that we will have a humanitarian disaster as those bodies are piling up in our communities. Understand that currently a certain amount of decompression happens along the border, so that people are being moved from Yuma to Phoenix, Yuma to Tucson, even from El Paso into Tucson, depending on what the flow of folks are. Absent federal support, we will have a humanitarian crisis. We need to be able to move folks efficiently to wherever their final destination is. We need comprehensive federal immigration reform that addresses some of those push factors that are pushing people from their countries. That's not something we as locals will be ever able to solve. That is something that is in the province of this Congress and the executive.
Thank you. I think that's an important message for us as the policymakers to understand that simply cutting off the funding doesn't solve the problem. It creates a crisis for local communities and still leaves us with policies that are ineffective. Thank you. Chief Hurd, though McAllister is not on the border, your community has experienced devastating effects of illicit narcotics, including fentanyl and methamphetamine, as you described in your opening statement. My colleagues and I have just introduced new bipartisan legislation called the Fend Off Fentanyl Act. Our legislation will enhance sanctions on drug cartels and others who are aiding and abetting the flow of fentanyl from Mexico to Arizona. Incidentally, on a recent trip to Mexico, I, Senator Cornyn, and others learned that the main corridor of fentanyl into the U.S. is through Arizona's border. So our goal is to cut off the financing sources for the drug cartels that they're using to purchase the precursor chemicals from China, manufacture them in Mexico, and then bring them up through Arizona into the U.S. What impact would a law such as this have for your officers in your community if the federal government were able to use this new tool to disrupt the finances of drug cartels?
Anything that would slow fentanyl coming into the United States would be a boom to law enforcement, especially on the local level. Because we run into fentanyl occasionally in McAllister. Right now, I don't have officers that's in the task force with the DEA or with LBN just because of staffing. But just on a regular basis, making traffic stops, working small cases, possession charges and stuff like that, we do come into contact with fentanyl. More than not, when we come into contact with fentanyl, it's on an accidental overdose. We have to deal with the Narcan that I discussed earlier. So it would obviously make our job safer, because CDC says 2 milligrams is enough to kill somebody. So it doesn't take much, and it's usually disguised as something else. We don't know it's fentanyl until it's too late.
That's right. Thank you. Senator Langford, I recognize you for another round of questions.
Thank you. Chief Hurd, I just want to be able to give context to everybody. We're talking about different towns and such here. McAllister is a community less than 20,000 people in Oklahoma.
Yes,
and so we talk about the effects of what's happening on the border and the effects of illegal drugs that are moving in. This is not New York City.
Correct.
This is a community of less than 20,000 people. It's just a really remarkable community, and a lot of great families and people that are there that are being directly affected based on the lack of enforcement on our southern border.
Thank you, sir. Exactly. Our community is, like I say, less than 20,000. Most people know everybody else. You either know them or you're related to, you know them through somebody else, 1 or 2 degrees. Everybody's affected. If it's somebody's son accidentally overdoses, everybody in the community is just devastated by that. We, like I say, if it doesn't take a great deal of narcotics to come in and really change the dynamics of our community, drop the prices, the overdoses, all the illegal activity just booms. People breaking into your cars, breaking into your house, stealing your stuff to sell it for drugs or trade it for drugs.
Yeah, and I think what most people don't realize is a lot of the theft, a lot of the burglaries that happen are individuals that are actually drug addicted as well, and they're trying to be able to feed a habit. And so it's not just what's happening with the drugs in the street, it's affecting lots of other folks as well.
The majority of the property crimes you can relate back to drugs, 100%.
Mayor McCall, thank you for your testimony on this as well today. I want to ask a more specific question. Did you talk already about social media and some of the effects of that? Sorry, I was in and out during the vote series as we're both trying to be able to come back and forth. You were talking specifically about social media being used to be able to recruit individuals in different communities, including yours, to be able to then drive loads of people, as they were referred to, that are coming into the country illegally.
Yes, sir.
And the dangers of that. What do you need the social media companies to do to be able to take responsibility for how their platform is being used? They seem to have filters and algorithms for everything, but they're not filtering out this algorithm.
Perfect, sir. We need this filter. I just got a text from Sheriff Daniels. We had just had 2 low cars pursuits on yesterday, 5 per car. Each one is going for $3,000 a head. So attracting these young people on this social media platform is how they're doing it. We need to shut it down, basically. I don't know how to do that. I don't know what it entails, but it was just 2 yesterday. I haven't got the numbers for today, but it's every day this is happening, and it's done by social media. They pinpoint a car to steal or to a rental, and then pinpoint the load. The load shows up. They pick them up, speed north.
We were talking before about push factors and the federal responsibility. Dr. Garcia, you brought this up as well. I would only say there's a significant push factor, but the challenge is, when we talk about the federal responsibility and push factors, is, as we've seen in the border of late, more than 150 countries that are coming. Now, they're dominantly coming from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela. We've got a certain group of countries that we've had a higher number from of late. Haiti. We understand some of those factors, but we literally have individuals from all over the world that are coming now in incredibly high numbers. The folks that are coming in from many areas of the world are not coming in based on poverty in that area. It's economic opportunity here in the United States. Part of the pull factor, I would say, from this is the ability to be able to cross the border and then to be able to stay. And at this point, as I had mentioned before to Mayor Nichols, we've got individuals that, if they cross the border, request to go to New York City for their asylum hearings. They're here for 2 decades before that process is complete. So whether they qualify or not, they still got to be in America for 2 decades in the process. That's a pretty significant pull factor. When you have the opportunity to be able to come in the United States of America, make just a declaration of the border, and then be able to travel anywhere in the country you want to be able to travel for the next 2 decades, and to be able to have a work permit in the process, that's a pretty big pull factor that's got to be resolved. Most of the individuals that are crossing the border also already have a family member here or a contact here somewhere. And I'm sure that y'all have experienced that as well, and the individuals that you've interacted with, that most already have a relationship here. And so it's not just I crossed the border, I'm fleeing from injustice somewhere else, I'm reconnecting with family that's already here. That's not the definition of asylum. That's economic opportunity, it's family reunification, but it's not the definition of asylum. So one of the things that we're trying to be able to go through, and what the administration thankfully has started to be able to take on of late, is to be able to look at this issue of asylum. And I know Senator Padilla brought this up a while ago on the asylum issues. I just want to be able to clarify a couple of things in this while we're talking about asylum, and to get some things on the record. One of them is the asylum, the definition is I can't find a safe place in my home country. Then if you can't find a safe place in your home country, in most of the world, you cross into the next safe country. That's the way it works. For instance, in Canada, if you cross the Canadian border and say, I'd like to request asylum, the first question they're going to ask you is, did you cross from the American side? If so, did you request asylum in the United States before you came to Canada? If you say, no, I didn't request asylum in the United States before I came to Canada, they say, thank you very much, and they push them right back here, or they push them back to the country of their original origin. That's Canadian law. That's true in most areas of Europe as well. If you actually cross into that country, they're going to say, did you request asylum in the country before you came into this country? If you're coming into Yuma from Uzbekistan, you've crossed into quite a few countries before you got our border to be able to cross into. But that's not being applied right now in the United States. They're not applying that. We're also not applying whoever's last in is first up in the hearing. If you just cross the border, we could have the next hearing is you. But right now, instead, we're saying, well, we'll put you in the queue, and 18 years from now is when you're actually going to get your hearing. That's a problem, obviously, because that encourages people to be able to come. If they knew they were next in the queue and that the asylum definition actually was consistent with what most of the world is for how they're handling asylum, that would be very, very different for most individuals, I believe, that we would be able to handle that differently. We also have a very low screening threshold. The first set of questions that we ask at the border is just, are you afraid in your country? And if they say yes, they're in the process. So we literally call it the magic words they just have to be able to say to cross the border, and then they're into this 2-decade-long process to be able to come in. Now, most of those individuals, when they get to the end, actually don't qualify for asylum if they actually stayed in the process, but they don't find out for a decade or more that they actually don't qualify because the screening threshold is so low. And then the last piece of this is if they don't qualify for asylum and a court does what's called a final order removal, saying you crossed the border, you requested asylum, but you actually don't qualify, we're actually not deporting those individuals. We say to them, you need to leave on your own, and they don't. So all of those factors together are a much larger issue of a pull factor to be able to pull people to the United States. When you have one of the greatest economies and quite frankly the greatest nation on God's earth, you have a lot of people around the world that are interested to be able to come. And when they've got family connections, that's one more piece to be able to say, gosh, you should come, to be able to come through the process. So I want to just be able to put that on the record, that I think this is one of the most significant issues we've got to be able to deal with, is how we handle asylum, how we handle E-Verify, and quite frankly, what this administration is going to do at the end of Title 42, which they have known about the end of Title 42 now for 2.5 years that it was coming. 2.5 years, everyone knew this was coming. Now it is in 2.5 weeks. So the question is, what is this administration going to do to be able to handle the hundreds of thousands of people that may flood across the border at that point? What policies are they going to put in place? Or after 2.5 years, are they just going to ignore it? Now, I'm not going to ask any of you to address that. That's not your area. That's up here in D.C., but you're just suffering the consequences where you are. So I just want to be able to say thank you very much for being here, making the long trip, and putting so much on the record today. It's very helpful to be able to have that dialogue. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Langford, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for traveling here from Arizona and Oklahoma to be here with us today. Like Senator Langford said, your comments on the record are important to the work that we're doing to try and build a bipartisan pathway forward to address these issues and relieve the burden on local communities as a result of the federal government's failure to address this issue. We have reached the end of the time for today's hearing, so I want to express again my appreciation for your time, your testimony. I want to thank my colleagues on the bench for their participation. This was a very important and, of course, a very timely hearing. I know there were many questions that I and others did not have the opportunity to ask, so I'll be submitting questions for the record so that we can continue examining this critical need. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on Thursday, May 11th, for the submission of statements and questions for the record.
May I just comment how ironic it is that May 11th is when that closes?
I was thinking the same thing, Senator Langford. I thought, wow, that's going to be quite a day. Maybe get him in on the 10th if you'd like. Thank you all again for your participation, and this hearing is adjourned.